Key performance indicators, commonly referred to as KPIs, are useful metrics that allow you to measure the success of your startup in various areas. KPIs can accelerate the growth of your venture. This episode provides an overview and examples of how to use KPIs in your business. We highly recommend giving KPIs a shot. You may be surprised at the positive results attained.
Our Favorite Tools for Entrepreneurs podcast addresses tools and concepts that are useful for the launch and growth of entrepreneurial ventures. Your two hosts will be Professor Gary Palin and serial entrepreneur Ryan Button.
Hello, Professor Palin. How are we?
Doing really well. How are you, Ryan?
Fantastic, as always. We've got together to discuss kind of a cool topic this morning. We're going to talk about KPIs, key performance indicators. Most people that have heard of a KPI associate it with a sales metric. Sales companies are really intense, typically about tracking the KPIs, how many calls you're making, how many emails you're sending, how many meetings you're setting. And they have lots of them depending on what the goal of the sales organization is. But something I do in my consultancy that I've seen lead to great results, and I've seen in really mature businesses that is a commonality between them, is using that concept of a key performance indicator in every aspect of the business. Disassociating it with just sales or purely marketing, is a lot of places you see it as well, and learning what the indicators are for everything, whether that's hiring and firing decisions, what your human capital management looks like, all the way to website tracking. The associations are never lacking. And the more seriously you take what these indicators are, the better analysis you can drive from it and the better results you're going to have internally in the business. So that's what we're here to talk about.
Awesome. You have more experience applying KPIs than I do. But one of the things that I always start with is I like to look where the end is before I start looking at what key performance indicators there are. So I look at my goals and then start working backwards. What are your thoughts on that?
That's exactly what I do as well. That's where are you trying to grow? What are you trying to drive from it? And then what are the indicators that are going to lead to that success? So what have you seen? And framing it in that way is often a good exercise because people can think back to, well, when this happened, the next thing was this. When this happened, the next thing was this. So what can you do to look out for whatever that this happened statement is?
And I've also used what I would look at as the primary KPI, what my major focus is, but then I'll have subsets of secondary KPIs.
Right. And oftentimes what I'll walk through with an organization is how many of these can we write down? How many dozen KPIs, how many indicators can we write down? And then what are the important ones? How can we narrow down what actually is driving a big impact? Because unless you're a really large organization with somebody dedicated to doing this, just simply looking out for these nominal things that happens can take up a lot of time.
You see that with the financial ratios. There's dozens and dozens of financial ratios, but what are the big impacts for your business? To me, it's the same with a KPI. What are the major things that you have to really watch?
That's exactly right. Ratios, different types of cash flow analysis or statements, EBITDA, all these big terms that people really focus on in finances is a huge one. A big KPI for finances is what do people's buying activity look like before they actually send you the money? Where are the dropout points?
Definitely. Could you give an example of specifically some of the diagnostic metrics? If someone's looking, how do I start with this?
The easiest, most available ones are sales metrics. How many calls, emails, meetings does it take to get the average sale? How many times do you have to call a customer before they respond to an email? Or how many emails is more likely before they respond to a call, before they set a meeting? How many meetings does it take to actually close a piece of business? That's why sales organizations typically use KPIs in a very regimented fashion, because those numbers are easy to drive. The other big ones you see is marketing. So how many times does somebody click on your website before they go through some sort of funnel? So some buying activity adds something to the cart. That's probably the next one. How many times do people add things to the cart and then not close that cart out and make it produce a sale? So what's the drop-off point so you can set expectations?
Now, where do you find that data when you're working with your clients?
Typically, it's through the Google analysis platforms, Google Webmaster Tools, Google Console, all have really great tools for doing that. There's Firebase as well if you're using mobile technologies. That's really good at tracking activity through mobile websites and mobile applications. Any sort of sales platform, there's tons that people plug into their websites, will all have quite a lot of marketing data that you can derive from it. For the people listening, my big takeaways for those is oftentimes you can go through a checklist and have it track everything. Don't do that. Figure out which ones are actually important. Them sending you an analysis at the end of the week with 500 data points on it isn't going to help you view your customers any better. Again, unless you're a marketing professional that really this is all they do. If you're a small startup, just do the big ones that really stand out to you, that lead to big results so you can actually track what's going on.
And if someone has never touched this and they wanted to play with it, I would suggest pick one and look at it and start playing with some of those numbers just to get a feel for it. And by getting a greater understanding of it, then you might be able to narrow it down to a few.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Another big one is human capital management. Turnover rate in small businesses is a big deal. Losing one person, if you're a 1,000-person organization, obviously is devastating. Nobody wants to ever lose somebody, but is a lot less devastating than losing one person if you're a 5-person organization. So keeping track of what do people typically do before they quit? What does their behavior look like? What are these indicators that they're about to quit or change jobs or go through a major life change? They're pretty easy to track and pay attention to. The big thing that I think this podcast is about is you have to pay attention to them for them to be able to inform you in any way.
And with those measurements, by the way, I'll just throw in a side note. We can't get into depth on this. There's major generational differences of why people stay in jobs and why people leave jobs.
Yeah. And I think that's changing right now as, Gen X enters the workforce. What their motivations are, a lot of research is showing is very different than my parents and your age demographic versus my age demographic versus sort of between me and the Gen X ages.
The reason I bring that up is specifically for the boomers that are starting ventures. Don't make the assumption of what motivates you is what motivates the people you're bringing onto your team. Then you will have that problem of high turnover. So measuring the correct measurements and understanding what to measure will be the key to success.
That's exactly right. Obviously, the sophistication level of these indicators throughout the business can vary hugely. I've seen really, really successful startups that are tracking 10. I've also seen technology startups that are tracking 10,000 of these, literally 10,000. And they're doing huge neural networking mapping to figure out what people do, how they can lead them, how they can influence them into typically a buying habit.
So the starting point, setting your goals. What would be the quick steps now as we wrap up to conclude for someone that just wants to start this?
The easiest thing, start an Excel sheet. Review it once a week and think about the indicators that have happened that week. What key things have happened this week that have led to another outcome? And just start tracking it. It's amazing what you can do, especially setting up a weekly cadence, because it's kind of fresh in your mind if it's weekly, on what you can derive and then get insight from. Do it for, I'd say, 2 months. Do it 8 times and then start looking back on it. And you can get the, wow, when this happened, this was the next step. And when this happened, this was the next step.
I'm glad you brought up that point because it's not an issue when you're under all of the pressure and stress of so many things coming at you in a startup. No one's going to be pushing you to look at KPIs. So you have to discipline yourself. And I would suggest make an appointment in your calendar weekly just to do this. And I think the benefits will pay off as you move forward.
Yeah. You'll also see, what am I over tracking? What am I under tracking? What do I not have enough information about? Those things become really, really apparent if you just start writing it down once a week.
Definitely. I agree 100%.
Fantastic. Well, any last thoughts that you have on KPIs, or should we let people start setting weekly meetings for themselves?
Well, I'm going to go back to your concluding statements very often. Take it very seriously.
There we go. Well, have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Ryan. You too.
Thanks for listening to our Favorite Tools for Entrepreneurs podcast. As always, you can head over to ProfSpirit.com to check out more resources and courses designed for you, the entrepreneur. Please follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, and others to get the most up-to-date information as it is released.